Penguin Random House Audio presents World Eaters: How Venture Capital is Cannibalizing the Economy. This is the author, Catherine Bracy. For the Builders. Introduction. It's hard to imagine a time and place that felt more optimistic and dystopian at once than San Francisco in the first half of the 2010s. It was the apex of the second tech boom, and the Bay Area was swimming in obscene amounts of money. Between them, Google, Facebook, and Apple were worth almost $1.5 trillion. A generation of newer companies like Uber and Airbnb, born out of the ashes of the Great Recession, were leading a second wave of tech behemoths that made their home in San Francisco rather than in the suburban office parks of Silicon Valley. Both Uber and Airbnb, and later Lyft, were the darlings of the era's sharing economy, a term that with hindsight now sounds Orwellian, but at the time spoke to the sense of naive possibility that many of us were eager to indulge. I arrived in San Francisco right at this moment, dispatched from President Barack Obama's re-election campaign headquarters in Chicago, where I was working as a product manager on the campaign's technology team, to open a novel technology field office. The tech field office would serve as an extension of the ambitious and innovative tech operation the campaign was spinning up in Chicago. Desperate for seasoned engineers and developers, but unable to attract enough of them to Chicago, the campaign's leadership sent me to California to do what organizers do: meet our people where they are. If they wouldn't come to us, we would go to them. Being in the Bay Area around that time was exhilarating. We were squarely in the middle of the Yes We Can era. The Great Recession was ending, an unprecedented bull market was accelerating, and the tech industry finally seemed like it was going to deliver the society that the internet's techno-utopian pioneers had promised. By the middle of the decade, though, the bloom was coming off the rose. 5 full years from the deepest point of the economic crisis, it was clear that the wealth being created by the booming recovery was accruing mostly at the top, as inequality hit unprecedented levels. In the Bay Area, the sense of haves versus have-nots was particularly stark, and tech bore the brunt of the blame. The cost of living was skyrocketing. Rents in the Bay Area grew by 50% in the 2010s, higher than in any other major metro in the country. And there were high-profile instances of tech workers and entrepreneurs doing and saying boneheaded, insensitive things, including one famous incident when a tech founder referred to those living on San Francisco's streets as hyenas. Behavior like this cemented the impression for everyone else that the tech community, the companies and workers alike, were only in it for themselves. Then came the buses. The economic recovery of the early 2010s coincided with the boom of cities. College-educated millennials who worked in the information economy, the creative class as Richard Florida termed them, had turned against suburbs and were seeking out the cultural richness and density that city living afforded. This meant that many of the 20-somethings flocking to the Bay to work at tech companies were putting down roots in San Francisco. Public transportation being what it is in car-centric California, the employers of this new wave of city living workers lacked a reliable way to get them to the suburban corporate campuses in Silicon Valley. The quickest solution was to set up private shuttle services to pick up workers in the city and ferry them down the peninsula. In the eyes of the companies, not only was this a perk for their workers, who didn't have to deal with commuter traffic or navigate a less-than-ideal public transportation system, but the Wi-Fi-enabled buses allowed them to be productive during the couple of hours a day they were traveling to and from the office. And of course, there was the benefit to the environment of taking potentially thousands of cars off the road every day. But the experience for everyone else was different. The hulking double-decker luxury coaches with blacked-out windows were a conspicuous nuisance on city streets that weren't designed to accommodate them. Adding insult to injury, they used public bus stops to pick up workers. The optics of well-off, mostly young, white tech workers stepping around those waiting for the city buses, many of whom were lower-income people of color who were not welcome on the tech shuttles, created a stark symbol of everything bad about tech in the city. Entitled millennials and their employers segregating themselves from everyone else. Instead of using their privilege and influence to make the public transportation system better for everyone, they bought a way around it, even as they relied on public infrastructure to enable their private system. By 2015, the civic dynamic in San Francisco had become truly toxic. It was common to see "fuck tech" graffitied around the city. I heard from many tech workers who had been spit on while walking around their neighborhoods. In 2014, at one demonstration against tech's incursion into the region, a protester climbed onto the roof of a Yahoo shuttle bus and vomited down its windshield. There was even an incident where someone shot live ammunition at buses as they headed down a freeway between San Francisco and Silicon Valley. But while the negative sentiment against tech was ratcheting up in San Francisco, the general sense across the Bay in Oakland, where I decided to put down roots after the campaign ended, was that tech gentrification was a San Francisco and Silicon Valley problem. The hassle of crossing the Bay to reach tech company offices gave longtime Oakland residents a false sense of security, that even if some gentrification happened, it would never be as bad as what our neighbors to the west were experiencing. The Oakland-based tech workers who were willing to deal with the longer commute were doing so because, for many of them, they valued what was special about the town as it is known, its culture and diversity, and were willing to contribute to it rather than treat the city as a playground. But even in our security across the Bay, it was hard to ignore what was happening in San Francisco, and Oaklanders watched with wariness, the way you might watch a wildfire move across the hills and hope the winds don't shift. Then came a 2015 announcement that shocked my neighborhood. Uber was coming to town. I knew almost immediately upon arriving in the Bay Area that if I were to live here for the long term, Oakland would be my home. It was a scrappy, diverse city with a chip on its shoulder, always in the shadow of its flashier neighbor across the bay. It reminded me of Detroit, near where I grew up, and I fell in love at first sight. I soon came to understand that Oakland's inferiority complex ran deep. But that dynamic was changing as we all watched San Francisco morph into what seemed like an extension of the bland monoculture of Silicon Valley. When Uber announced they were expanding to downtown Oakland, buying an old department store building and bringing 2,500 jobs, everything changed at once. Almost immediately after the news broke, a campaign called No Uber Oakland sprang up. The mayor, who hadn't been informed about the move in advance, hastily threw together a press conference in which she tried to walk a fine line between city boosterism — there was no doubt Oakland could use the tax base Uber would bring — and channeling the trepidation that many of her constituents felt. As a newly diehard Oaklander myself, I understood where the fear was coming from. At the same time, as a civic technologist who had spent my whole career working to make the internet a force for shared prosperity and robust democracy, I was riveted by the dynamics. Before I joined the Obama campaign, I had spent the first 8 years of my career working at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet Society, now the Berkman Klein Center. Those 8 years, 2002 through 2010, were some of the most important in the history of the internet. Mark Zuckerberg and a group of his Harvard roommates, one of whom was a student who spent time at the Berkman Center, started Facebook in 2004. What is thought to be the first podcast was recorded at the Berkman Center's conference room table. We incubated a community that grew into an organization called Global Voices, which pioneered the practice of citizen journalism and fostered democracy around the world. We hosted idealistic operatives from Howard Dean's internet-driven campaign and watched in awe as a Harvard Law graduate leveraged digital tools to become the first Black president of the United States. I had a front-row seat for all of it, and by the time I joined President Obama's re-election campaign, I had come to believe that the internet was going to be a force for democracy and opportunity in the world, maybe even the most democratizing technology in human history. So when Uber came to town and the community revolted, I had to ask myself some tough questions. Uber was the most valuable privately owned company in the world. They were offering to bring thousands of high-quality jobs to a place where the median income was about $25,000 per year, but the community saw it as a threat instead of an opportunity. Why? Did it have something to do with Oakland's famously leftist political sensibilities? Was there something specific to the economic context of the place or time? Or were the characteristics of the tech sector itself causing its growth to create harm for everyone else? Most important, what would it take for tech's growth to be a rising tide that lifted all boats? I decided to devote myself to answering those questions. I co-founded an advocacy organization, Tech Equity Collaborative, in an attempt to bend the trajectory of the tech industry's impact on the economy, as well as the corrosive effect that tech-fueled inequality was having on the civic dynamic. Maybe we could turn Uber's presence in Oakland from a crisis to an opportunity, I thought. Instead of trying to stop Uber from coming, we could engage the tech industry to be better corporate citizens, more like the auto companies of my Midwestern youth who saw their success as intrinsically tied to the communities around them. We would engage both tech workers in their...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?